All right. Welcome to another deep dive with us. You guys sent us a really interesting book this time called Debunking Sam Harris, a Christian response.
That's right.
And, I think it's really timely because Sam Harris is um he's kind of a big deal in the intellectual world these days.
He really is.
He's a
Yeah.
he's a prominent voice. He's written a lot of best-selling books, and a lot of what he says resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah.
People find him to be very persuasive.
Yeah. Yeah. And particularly persuasive in his critiques of religion and religious belief.
Right, exactly.
So this book is kind of taking the other side of that.
Yeah, it's coming at it from a very specific perspective, right?
Yes.
Which is that of Christian apologetics.
That's right.
And so I think, our goal today is to kind of unpack what this book is saying, because I think a lot of our listeners are interested in this this kind of debate between atheism and theism.
Right. And especially the arguments that Sam Harris puts forward, because he is, known for his very strong arguments and clear thinking.
Right. And so we want to make sure that we're not just telling you what this book is saying, but we're also helping you to understand why they're saying it and kind of the kind of reasoning behind it.
Yeah, the deeper thinking behind it, not just giving you a summary, but really diving into it.
Exactly. So why don't we just jump right in?
Yeah, sounds good.
The book is structured, I think it's divided into a bunch of different chapters, and each chapter kind of tackles a different aspect of Sam Harris's thinking.
That's right. It's very structured that way.
And so I think we'll kind of follow that structure. The first chapter that I think we should talk about is chapter 2, which is called The Moral Landscape.
Okay.
Questioning Objective Morality.
Okay, yes, that's a key one because this really gets to the heart of a lot of Harris's arguments.
Right. And it's based on one of his books, The Moral Landscape, where he kind of lays out this argument that science can determine moral truths based on human well-being.
Yes, and he argues that God is not necessary for us to understand what's right and wrong.
Right. We don't need a divine lawgiver.
Right, we can figure it out scientifically.
Yeah, we can figure it out through observation and the scientific method.
Exactly.
So what's the core Christian pushback here? Like how does this book kind of take issue with that claim?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually a multi-layered argument that they present in the book.
Okay.
The first thing they kind of go after is this idea of scientifically defining well-being.
Okay.
Harris talks about, morality being all about maximizing well-being, but the book points out that defining well-being is not as simple as it might seem. What constitutes well-being is actually pretty complex, and it can differ a lot between people and cultures.
Sure.
What might be seen as, promoting well-being in one culture might be seen as, detrimental in another culture.
Yeah, it's very subjective.
Exactly. And so they argue that it's not as straightforward as Harris makes it sound.
I see. So basically, even the foundation of his argument is already kind of shaky.
Right, because it rests on this assumption that we can have this objective, definition of well-being that everyone agrees on, and the book is saying that that's not really the case.
Okay, that makes sense. And then they also bring up this philosophical concept called the eyes-ought problem, right?
That's right, they do.
Something's called Hume's law.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you kind of explain what that is and how it relates to this argument?
Yeah, so basically the eyes-ought problem is this idea that just because we observe things happening in the world doesn't automatically tell us how things should be. Science is very good at describing what is,
right.
It can observe phenomena, it can come up with theories to explain why things happen the way they do, but it doesn't necessarily prescribe what is right or wrong.
Got it.
So, for example, science can tell us, how, the human body works,
yeah.
How diseases spread, but it doesn't tell us whether it's morally right or wrong to, treat those diseases or to let people suffer.
Right. It's just describing the mechanism.
Exactly. It's just describing the mechanism.
But it doesn't tell us what we should do about it.
Exactly. And that's a core part of the Christian critique here.
Okay. So basically, the book is arguing that Harris is trying to derive an ought from an is.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to say that because we can observe certain things about human well-being,
Right.
therefore we can know what's morally right and wrong.
Exactly.
But that doesn't necessarily follow
Right.
from a logical standpoint.
So, right.
Okay, so if science can't tell us what we should do, where does the Christian perspective turn for that guidance?
Well, the book argues that morality is rooted in God's character.
Okay,
It's not just about avoiding suffering, although that's certainly a part of it,
sure.
but it's about aligning ourselves with a higher purpose.
Got it.
Which is often described, through the concept of agape love,
Right.
which is a selfless and unconditional love.
Okay.
The book even brings in C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
who famously argued that our innate sense of justice, that feeling that some things are truly right and others truly wrong,
Yeah.
that points to a universal moral law and, by extension, a moral lawgiver.
I see. So we kind of have this intuition that there's a right and a wrong,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and that points to something beyond ourselves.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. So the takeaway here is that even the attempt to establish an objective morality based on science inadvertently hints at something that goes beyond the physical world. It suggests that there's something else out there that is the source of this moral law.
That's right. And that's a fundamental flaw, the book argues, in Harris's, naturalistic worldview.
Right, because he's trying to explain everything, within the realm of the natural world.
Exactly.
And the Christian perspective is saying, well, no, there's something beyond that.
Right, that's right.
Okay, so that's a really interesting critique. Let's move on to the next chapter then. Chapter 3, which is called Free Will and Divine Sovereignty, where Harris falters.
Okay. Yeah, this one is a bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah, this one gets pretty deep pretty quickly.
It does. It does.
But it's really important, to understand this issue of free will.
It really is.
Because it has implications for everything, really.
It does.
So Harris, in his book Free Will, he contends that our feeling of making conscious choices is actually an illusion. It's a result of brain activity that happens before we're even aware of the decision.
Right.
So basically, he's saying we don't really have free will.
That's right.
So how does this book kind of respond to that?
Well, the book does a good job of kind of unpacking this complex issue.
Yeah.
And it suggests that while neuroscience can show us how our brains process decisions,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily explain the underlying why of our choices.
I see.
Particularly the conscious element of deliberation and intention.
Sure.
We might be able to see, what parts of the brain light up when someone makes a decision.
Right.
But that doesn't tell us why they made that decision.
Right. It doesn't tell us what they were thinking or feeling.
Exactly.
Or what their motivations were.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Christian view, as presented here, it affirms both God's sovereignty,
Okay.
his ultimate authority and control,
Yeah.
and human free will.
Got it. So we could hold both of those ideas at the same time.
Right. And that might seem like a contradiction to some people.
Sure.
But the book argues that it's not.
Okay.
It's a complex theological concept,
Right.
but they point to examples in Scripture, like the story of Joseph in Genesis,
Okay.
where both God's plan and human choices are seen as operative.
I see. So God has a plan,
Yes.
but we still have the freedom to make our own choices.
Right. And sometimes those choices align with God's plan and sometimes they don't.
Right. But ultimately, God is in control.
Exactly. He's working all things together for good, as Romans 8.28 says.
Okay. So if our decisions are predetermined, what does that mean for concepts like sin and accountability? Like if we don't really have a choice, how can we be held responsible for our actions?
Yeah, that's a crucial point that the book raises.
Yeah.
If we don't have genuine free will,
Right.
then the very idea of moral responsibility becomes problematic. How can we be held accountable for our actions, judged as righteous or sinful,
Right.
if those actions were simply the inevitable outcome of prior neurological events?
Yeah. It doesn't seem fair.
Right.
It doesn't seem like it would be, a just system.
Exactly. And the Christian understanding of justice, both divine and human,
Yeah.
relies heavily on the premise of free will.
Okay, so the book is basically saying that if we don't have free will, then the whole idea of morality and justice kind of falls apart.
It does. It does. It really undermines the whole foundation of those
Yeah,
concepts.
yeah, that's a huge point. And there's also this kind of interesting self-referential argument that the book
Yeah.
brings up
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
regarding Harris's stance on free will.
Right. It's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah, yeah.
They point out this self-defeating aspect of his argument.
Okay.
If free will is just an illusion,
Mm-hmm.
then Harris's very arguments against it are also predetermined. They would simply be the result of his brain chemistry,
Yeah, yeah.
not necessarily the product of reasoned thought and logical deduction aimed at persuading others.
Yeah, yeah.
So it raises this question, why should we even consider his arguments if they aren't freely chosen conclusions?
Right, right. He's not really arguing. He's just kind of spouting off whatever his brain is telling him to say.
Right. And that's a significant internal inconsistency the book argues in his philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. It undermines the whole idea of rational debate.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 4, which is called Spirituality Sans God, a Flawed Conception.
Okay, yes. This one's a bit different.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of a different angle.
It is, yeah.
So in Harris's book, Waking Up, he talks about spiritual experiences.
Right.
But he talks about them as being achievable through practices like meditation,
Mhm.
independent of religious belief.
Right. He's kind of advocating for a secular spirituality.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
can have the benefits of spirituality without the baggage of religion.
Right, right.
That's kind of his argument there.
So how does the Christian perspective kind of engage with that idea?
Well, the core of the Christian counter-argument here
Mhm.
is that Christian spirituality is fundamentally about a relationship with a personal God.
Right.
It's not just about achieving a certain state of awareness or a particular neurological experience.
Right. It's not just about feeling good or having a mystical experience.
Wow, exactly.
It's about something deeper than that.
It's about a connection with the divine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the book also points out that Harris, while he draws on practices and concepts found in religions like Buddhism and Hinduism,
Mm-hmm.
he kind of does so while rejecting the theistic foundations of those traditions.
Right. He wants the benefits of these practices
Mhm.
without the source from which they come.
Yeah. So he's kind of picking and choosing.
He is.
Yeah.
He's taking what he likes and leaving what he doesn't like.
Yeah. And the book is saying, well, can you really do that?
Right. Can you really divorce these practices from their original context
Right.
and still retain their full meaning and significance?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. So from a Christian viewpoint, what's missing in this spirituality without God? Like what's the problem with that?
Well, the book argues that God is the very source of purpose, meaning, and the moral framework within Christian spirituality.
No.
Stripping away God
Mhm.
from this perspective ultimately diminishes the sense of moral obligation
I see.
and leaves life without a truly ultimate purpose.
Okay. So it's kind of like you're trying to build a house,
Mm-hmm.
but you're missing the foundation.
Exactly.
You're trying to have the walls and the roof,
Right.
but you don't have anything to support it.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. And this chapter suggests that Harris's conception of spirituality lacks a coherent foundation without acknowledging a divine reality. I see. I see. So it's ultimately incoherent.
Yes, that's the argument.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to chapter 5 then, which tackles the limits of science, where Harris goes astray.
Okay, yes, this is another important one.
Yeah, yeah, because he's very much a proponent of science.
He is.
He often champions science as the primary,
If not the only.
if not the only, reliable way to understand reality.
Mm-hmm.
And he sometimes dismisses religion as mere superstition.
Right, he sees it as outdated
Yeah, yeah.
and no longer necessary.
Yeah, so what's the Christian response to this high view of science?
Well, the book acknowledges the immense value of science in understanding the natural world,
Sure.
but it argues that it operates within certain limitations.
Okay.
Specifically, it highlights the concept of methodological naturalism, which means science, by its very nature, focuses on explaining phenomena through natural causes.
Okay.
And this makes it ill-equipped to address existential, ethical, and spiritual questions.
I see.
that lie outside the realm of empirical observation and testing.
Right, right, because
Yeah.
those are questions that science can't really answer.
Exactly. They're not questions that can be answered through experimentation or observation.
Yeah, yeah.
And we come back to that is-ought gap here as well.
Right.
Science can tell us how the world is, but it doesn't inherently tell us what its meaning is or how we ought to live.
Got it, got it. So basically the book is saying that Harris is making a category mistake.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to use science to answer questions that it's not designed to answer.
Right. He's overstepping the boundaries of
Yeah,
science.
yeah, exactly. And doesn't the book also point out that even science relies on certain underlying assumptions?
Absolutely.
Like it's not as self-evident as some people might think.
It's not a completely neutral, objective system.
Yeah, yeah.
It has its own set of assumptions.
Yeah. So what are some of those assumptions?
Well, the book reminds us that science itself rests on certain metaphysical assumptions that it cannot prove.
Okay.
For example, the belief that the universe is rational and ordered,
Right.
and that our cognitive faculties are reliable enough to understand it.
Right, right. We have to assume that our senses are giving us accurate information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But science itself can't prove that.
Right, right. That's interesting. So basically the book is saying that Harris is being naive about science. He's not really acknowledging the philosophical underpinnings of it.
Right. He's taking it for granted.
Yeah, yeah.
And not really thinking critically about it.
Yeah. And the Christian perspective, as presented, it doesn't necessarily see a conflict between faith and reason.
No, not at all.
Or science and religion.
No, they can actually work together.
Yeah.
They can complement each other.
Yeah. And in fact, the book points to a long historical tradition of their integration.
That's right.
With thinkers like Augustine, Aquinas, and more recently Alvin Plantinga, who have kind of explored the relationship between faith and reason.
Exactly. And they've shown that there's not necessarily this conflict that Harris makes it out to be.
Right, right. It's not an either or situation.
It's not.
Yeah.
They can actually coexist and even enhance each other.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. So the critique here is that Harris potentially elevates science to a position it wasn't designed to occupy, neglecting other valid ways of understanding reality.
Exactly. He's putting science on a pedestal and ignoring other ways of knowing.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty now.
Yeah, we're getting down to the brass tacks.
Yeah, chapters 12 and 13 get very specific, looking at Harris factual errors and Harris logical errors and fallacies as identified by the book.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into those.
Yeah, so let's start with the factual claims.
Okay.
What are some of the factual errors that the book identifies in Harris's work?
Well, this part of the book argues that Harris's overall narrative contains several inaccuracies.
Okay.
For instance, it suggests he sometimes engages in historical revisionism by primarily blaming religious fervor for violence while downplaying other contributing factors.
Okay, so he's kind of painting religion with a very broad brush.
He is, and not really acknowledging the complexities of history.
Right, right.
It also claims that he misrepresents core tenets of Christian theology,
Okay.
Such as the doctrines of hell, salvation, and the Trinity, often focusing on more extreme or less nuanced interpretations.
Got it. So he's kind of taking the worst examples.
He is, and presenting them as if they're representative of the whole.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. The book also mentions the potential use of the no true Scotsman fallacy.
Yes, it does.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the no true Scotsman fallacy is basically a way of dismissing counterexamples.
Okay.
So let's say, you're arguing that all Scotsmen are brave, and someone points out a Scotsman who's a coward.
Right.
You might say, well, he's not a true Scotsman then.
I see.
So you're basically redefining the category.
Yeah, you're moving the goalposts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book suggests that Harris might do something similar with religion.
Okay.
He might dismiss positive examples of religious individuals or actions as not being true representatives of their faith.
I see.
Which allows him to maintain a more negative portrayal.
Okay, that's interesting. What are some other factual errors that the book identifies?
Well, they also talk about oversimplified readings of religious texts like the Bible, a failure to adequately acknowledge the historical connections and symbiosis between science and religion.
Right, because there's actually a lot of overlap there.
There is, there is.
Yeah.
And then also presenting a deterministic view of neuroscience and free will as a settled scientific consensus when it's still a topic of ongoing debate.
Right, right. He's kind of presenting it as a done deal
He is
when it's not.
when it's not.
Yeah, okay. And then finally, the book suggests an over-reliance on purely empirical data when discussing abstract philosophical concepts.
Right. He's trying to apply a scientific lens to things that aren't necessarily scientific.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the overarching point here is that these alleged factual errors,
Yes.
they undermine the accuracy and the fairness of Harris's critique.
They do. They do.
Yeah, if he's getting his facts wrong,
Right.
then his whole argument kind of falls apart. Okay. Let's turn to chapter 13 then, where the book outlines what it sees as Harris logical errors and fallacies.
Okay. Yeah. This one is a little more technical.
Yeah, we're getting into the logic weeds here.
We are.
But it's important to understand these fallacies
It is.
because they can be very persuasive.
They can.
But they're not logically sound.
Right.
So, what are some of the main logical missteps that the book identifies?
Well, the book points to several types of logical fallacies.
Okay.
It suggests instances of ad hominem attacks where Harris might criticize religious believers personally rather than addressing their arguments.
Okay, so he's attacking the person
He is,
instead of the argument.
instead of the argument.
Yeah.
And then also straw man fallacies where religious beliefs are caricatured or distorted to make them easier to refute.
Right. So he's kind of setting up a fake version of the argument
He is
and then knocking it down.
knocking it down.
Yeah. Okay. What other fallacies does the book point to?
Well, they also identify potential false dilemmas
Okay.
where Harris might present science and religion as mutually exclusive options when
Right.
they might not be.
Yeah.
Slippery slope arguments suggesting that moderate religious belief inevitably leads to extremism.
Right. That's a common one.
It is.
Yeah.
And then also begging the question,
Okay.
where Harris's arguments implicitly assume the superiority of rationality and empiricism without adequately justifying that assumption.
So he's kind of assuming what he's trying to prove.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. What else?
They also point to potential appeals to authority, where Harris might selectively cite sources that support his views without engaging with counter-arguments.
So he's cherry-picking his evidence.
He is.
Yeah, okay.
And then finally, circular reasoning, where the irrationality of religious beliefs is assumed as a premise to prove their irrationality.
Right. So he's basically saying religious beliefs are irrational because they're irrational.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So the overall argument here is that these perceived logical flaws, they weaken the validity of Harris's conclusions.
They do.
Yeah.
They make his arguments less persuasive.
Right. Because if he's not using sound logic,
Right.
then we can't really trust his conclusion.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So chapter 16 then makes a rather surprising claim.
Okay.
It's called Harris the Relativist.
Right. It's a bit of a twist.
Yeah. It's kind of a turning the tables on him.
It is.
So Harris is a vocal critic of moral relativism. But this chapter argues that he ends up there.
Right. He ends up contradicting himself.
Yeah. So how does the book make that argument?
Well, it argues that while Harris explicitly rejects moral relativism and seeks to ground morality in objective scientific principles of well-being,
Right.
his very approach unintentionally leads back to it.
Okay, I see.
The book suggests that Harris's empirical framework for morality is ultimately contingent on human knowledge and the ability to accurately measure well-being,
Right.
both of which are subject to change and interpretation.
Right. So basically the foundation of his argument is shaky.
It is. It
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
It's not as objective as he makes it out to be.
Right. So the very definition of well-being becomes a point of potential relativity.
Exactly.
Okay.
The book highlights that what constitutes well-being can vary significantly across different cultures, historical periods, and even individual preferences.
Yeah.
What might be seen as promoting well-being in one context might be seen as detrimental in another context.
Right. It's all relative.
It is.
Yeah.
And the book argues that despite Harris's intentions,
Hmm.
his attempt to ground morality scientifically
Yeah,
ultimately stumbles back into the relativism he seeks to avoid.
I see. So it's kind of like